Go. This is nice. Don't just find yours, you can find other people's. Okay. Someone finding? Yeah, okay. Okay. What are we waiting for? Start. We've reached the tipping point in which feminist rhetoric is overused and has been abused countlessly when wanting to impose women's rights in countries that exist in the Middle East. We find that the West are the only group of countries that will most likely be the ones going in and intervening in order to impose the existence of women's rights within those nations. We see that organic change within those countries itself, like Saudi Arabia, where there is a flex in laws to allow them to drive, to allow women to drive now, is something that we better condone within our side of the setup, because we find that every time an intervention is used, two things happen. Number one, there's a lack of sustainability. Number two, you propagate the idea of anti-Westernism themes within the local group of people that exists in these Middle Eastern countries in that instance, right? Two things that will be argued within the construct of my speech. Number one, how women are the most vulnerable group when we militarily intervene within this nations. Number two, how this will most likely fuel the kind of hardliners that the feminist movement will not want to support as we go forward in wanting to implement women's rights, right? So let's use a case parallel to examine how when military interventions are being used in existence by the West itself, things don't necessarily exist as they want to wish. We use the example of Iraq, right? So even if the United States claims that democracy now exists within Iraq, we still see that the existence of military presence within the nation itself is something that continues to show that there is a lack of development within the military intervention, even if it was claimed to have ended. That's why recently Noura al-Maliki was placed into position, and that was something that was highly influenced by the United States government itself. It wasn't something that was locally empowered by the people, wherein democracy is claimed to exist, right? So when there is a continuation of military existence and that presence, even after you claim for the intervention to have ended, that goes into showing how there is a lack of sustainability, because the local people are less likely to be competent enough to sustain themselves, because they've always been placed under this dependency that there will be the existence of military forces within the countries itself to carry out all these objectives, to fulfill the kind of democratic ideas in the nations itself, like we said. So let's analyze, using that example, how women are the most vulnerable community when the military intervention does take place. We both agree, both sides of the house, that the odds are extremely against women in these circumstances. Number one, when a military intervention itself, the direct opposition to it comes from men who are able to pick up guns and fight against such existence. In this instance, women don't have that same ability to protect themselves. So already then you're pushing themselves to the farthest ends of the corners, wherein they not only are unable to protect themselves, but you put them in a highly displaced position. But when a military intervention takes place, right, that's when we see women being misused, like conflict women when the Japanese invaded countries. Women are always victims of mass rape in these instances, because even if you want to achieve the imposition of women's rights in the end, the means to getting it is always misconstrued, because there is no proper recording of it. No one properly assesses the kind of methods used by the United States government or any government in that sort to want to achieve women's rights. So in that principle, that's how women are most likely to be affected when they are supposed to be the ones protected in these circumstances. Yes.
Is this debate only extending to whether military interventions should happen or not? Or given that it is inevitable, whether the feminist movement should take a stance to oppose or support military intervention?
Even if we do not agree that military intervention should take place in the first place, but if it does agree, the feminist movement should never take a stance to support the idea of military intervention, right? Because the feminist movement in itself is has their own school of thought in which they practice, in which they implement their own ideologies to organic empowerment of women, wherein women within Saudi Arabia itself, locals there, feminist leaders within that group, them empowering other women within their society. That's the kind of feminist movement that we support. That's the kind of women's rights that we want to have within those communities. If the feminist movement were to support a hardline approach, a hard stance approach, saying that we can intervene into a country just so we can achieve a bigger goal, you see that is something that dilutes the value of the feminist movement, because now they'll be viewed as a movement that is automatically hardline. And when they are viewed in that stance, the locals that who are directly affected by the military intervention will more likely flag it as an anti-Western, as a Westernism kind of a idea. And that's when, in that patriarchal stance, when men are more likely to oppose women, will go further and oppose women in that circumstances, because they want to oppose the kind of military interventions happening. And they also want to prove that we still have control for women. So the most likely outcome from your military intervention is less likely to be benefited by these women themselves, because they will be constructively opposed and constructively continuously oppressed by men under those circumstances, right? Because it will be mislabeled as an idea to oppose it and to label it as an anti-Westernism kind of a notion. And when that happens, that's when the form of feminism, like cultural feminism, is not encouraged and is not supported within the societal structures that exist within the countries that you are intervening into. That's when the military, that's when the feminist movement chooses to side with more radical approaches and does not choose to respect the kind of cultural feminism, the kind of religious feminism that exists within these Middle Eastern nations. So for all these reasons, we find that feminist rhetoric being used as a form of a reason to have military intervention to impose or to further women's rights is not something that we can condone for two important reasons. Number one, there will be the most vulnerable groups within the society, and they will less likely be protected, which is an undermining value to the whole idea of intervening in itself. But secondly, they will more likely fuel hardliners to oppose the idea of military intervention happening in that instance. And when that opposition exists, the outcome of wanting to have women's rights, to liberate women from the clutches of oppression, is less likely to take place. And for all these reasons, we are proud to support. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I invite the leader of the opposition to flash.
In a world where women cannot get jobs simply because they're women, in a world where sexuality is defined as men and men only, we think change is going to happen within the state. We think there needs to be an outside and external force, especially when it comes to military intervention that we're supporting, that changes the way these patriarchal, conservative societies work. A few clarifications about what outside the house is fighting for. Firstly, we think intervention is a last case policy. That means we're going to have sanctions, we're going to have talks, we're going to have all the things we need to change these states and the way they behave and their psychological aspects. The first phase. Intervention is the last step, it's not the first step. That's a misconception that's how the house is bringing. Secondly, we think these interventions are not only going to be done by Western states. We think generally we support interventions done by global communities or global powers in the first place, or we're simply going to allow people on the ground to intervene within these movements. We don't think the West themselves are going to do it completely, because we think other sectors of the world will try fight this. Thirdly, on the extent of violence, this is very important clarification. We support any strategic sit-down. We support any strategic killings that need to be happen. So within a certain city, there's a political leader that creates policies that heavily oppress individuals. We're perfectly fine with them being assassinated. But we're not fine with things like mass killings or mass rapes that happen. We think there needs to be the extent of control. We think that is possible, and it's with this military intervention. We do not want to exacerbate the problem with violence. Outside, we simply want to fight for the ability to change the way these states work. We think if that can be done without killing, it's fine. But because of the way that these states are conservative, inherent faster to generations, we think that change cannot happen within these states. think this is where external force is needed. I'm going to argue to you as to why intervention is the best way to change the way these states will work. But before that, a few of the ideas that OG tried to bring to this today. Firstly, on the idea of lack of sustainability. Because they try to argue to you that interventions don't work because they never follow through. Well, that's simple. Keep the troops there. Keep the military presence within the state. Allow them to have just peacekeepers. And this is very important because when they are there in active presence, that is when you have to change your ways completely. But if you were to military intervention to enter and then leave immediately after the war, then no change is going to occur. When they try to come up here to Iraq, that's when President Obama decided to brought troops back home. We think that they kept them there, the ability for democracy to flourish within the state is more possible. Same thing on the this side of the house. When you keep the presence of these global communities as peacekeepers there, it's more likely that the states, especially the people, will be forced to think more about the fact that they're doing something wrong, and that's when you can get change within these societies and within the state in general. Sit down. But secondly, on the idea of how family movements are diluted on their side, within these conservative states that tell you women are useless, how do feminist movements already have any traction in the first place? They are already diluted within these states. They already do not get any ability to speak their voices and change the way people work. What we do on the other hand is have the ability for these feminist movements to come out and say something. We give them the voice that they don't have on their side. Dilution cannot happen. There's nothing to dilute in the first place. I think that doesn't work. I think that when you allow intervention to occur, you simply bring the idea of suppression. You allow feminist movements to get a global voice and a global ability to say what's going on within the state.
While it was really bad that previously these women weren't allowed to go to school and to jobs, why is it any better for them that now with your military incursion they're being caught in the crossfire and killed?
We think it's better for them to be caught in a crossfire and killed, no matter how wrong it is, rather than face an oppression that cannot change on the inside. Something I'm going to argue to you within my argument. So let's get to the argument of how intervention is the best case to do this. Firstly, let's look at these type of conservative states in the first place. In terms of how they oppress women in the way they view women. These type of principles are passed on through inherited principles when states, especially in through like monarchies and all that. That means they are brought from young believing that women are the weaker sex. And because of the government's belief this, by default, the people on the ground believe this. People on the ground are more likely to believe that it's fine to execute a woman for being promiscuous in the street. It's fine not to allow women to wear clothes that they want to or do what they want to. It's fine. Because if the government tells me it's fine, then it's perfectly acceptable. That's what happens in these conservative states. They believe that the weaker sex, they do not offer things like basic human rights that men do, and generally they get oppressed to the point where it's not willing for them to live in this world. But we think that these sort of things are harmful. But when you bring in outside intervention, these governments are likely to take notice of the fact that they may be doing something wrong, because these interventions themselves are going to because these interventions themselves will happen after thought, after sanctions. That means these heads of states are knowing that there's a problem, especially in the way that they treat women, in the way the society is made up, sit down, and that's when they're going to change. Because no states are really willing to take part in war, because a lot of these states are not capable of fighting wars. But even if the states that are capable of fighting wars, they do not want the risk of being sanctioned or being segregated by global community. We think there's a lot of harm that comes when these type of things occur. We think that especially in these states are poorer than most states, because the way conservative in the third world, they're more likely to appear to outside. Because intervention will only happen after all these talks and sanctions, so that's when we use our voice to act. We think violence sometimes is the right way to do it. Sit down. But secondly, we think intervention is the best way to do this because we cannot wait for internal change. Because organic change cannot happen when there's no ability for them to speak. Because these individuals already do not have any voice and any traction in the first place. Feminist movements cannot come up and tell you that it's wrong for me to get prostitutes because I'm wearing my type of clothes. We think that it cannot happen from within. But when intervention is the only measure, we think that intervention is just the only measure. Why? Because these liberal ideas will come into the country. Because there's already been long-standing talks with governments and heads of state that tell you it's wrong to treat women this way. We think that intervention is big because it's very important. Why? Why is it very important intervention to this? Because we think you empower feminist movements on the outside. Why? Because now these feminist movements can understand that these interventions have a goal to help these women. And generally a global community will pay attention to these countries, and these feminist movements can speak out now. They have an ability to say, if these global superpowers tell you that your action is wrong, then by default you're wrong and we are right. Feminist movements gain an ability to say, if you're wrong, you're being treated this way, and with that, you have been more proud of.
All right. Deputy Prime Minister.
In 2009, Noura Al-Fayed became the first Deputy Minister of Education in Saudi Arabia, a country that did not legalize driving, that required permission for women to even leave their house. We think we have progressed within this country. However small it may be, the progression exists, and the right-opening government believes that if you take any stance to intervene within this country, you are not only going to detract from this progression, you are going to harm the way that women exist. We think the entrenchment of oppression within these countries is not one that is only within government, it's within every community that exists, within every father, within every child. Let me question open opposition. You also assassinate these people, because eventually these people are also going to vote in elections and going to put in the same people that they believe should oppress women. So we don't think your policy of assassinating individuals and changing the government for one election is going to keep anyone in power for sustainable change. I'm going to answer one question before I go on to two substantive points. My first substantive point is going to be why you lose the moral legitimacy that comes with the feminist movement and how you're going to isolate women. And second of all, in the event where there's a progression of the value of feminism, you're going to not be able to change these communities. First, I'm going to answer one question. How will you have sustainable change? Their version of sustainable change was through peacekeepers. How we're going to keep peacekeepers there as long as it takes for us to develop a government that believes in human rights. First, we think that your side will keep peacekeepers forever, as in every election where people are going to be against your government that has policies that help women's rights, something that is not entrenched in government but entrenched within fatwas, entrenched within your religious scriptures. We think individuals are not going to change even if you have policies in place. Second of all, even if those policies are in place, these individuals will still have the ability to clamp down on women in homes, things that don't have policies to fight for. For example, not allowing your wife to get jobs, telling your wife that this is an attack on Islam. These are things your policies cannot solve. But third of all, how long are your peacekeepers going to be there? Because you're never going to have a democracy if you're going to keep peacekeepers there to maintain policies. We think that eventually that's going to be unsustainable for Western or even Arab nations to do, because this is something that requires an ongoing flow of money, something intervention lack of it. Second of all, you dilute the traction within the states, because he said there's no movement that already exists, therefore we fight for this. Then say if cultural feminism does not exist within these countries, the feminist movement can endorse small movements within these countries. They can financially aid these people in representing their version of feminism, because we don't think the Western form of feminism is the only school of thought that exists, and the cultural feminism within these areas, if anything, should be developed better. That's why we don't think intervention is the only method to do so. Third thing he said is we do not support collateral damage. That's going to have perpetual harm. If your policy is going to fight for intervention, you are definitely going to go through some form of collateral damage. And if you do agree that you're fighting for women's rights, this women become the backing rams for a lot of these people who are hide behind human shields, who are hide behind women and children because you want to attack women because you're fighting for women's rights. Therefore, your side will inevitably have collateral damage that will harm women physically. But more importantly, if your side wants to fight for intervention, it's not going to be sustainable. You're going to keep attacking the infrastructures that women need for bettering themselves. For example, schools and job opportunities, where people on the ground can use the excuse that you attack all our infrastructure, we cannot provide these rights to women for their intervention. But third of all, how are we able to facilitate it? Because he said this gives traction to states or women on the ground to fight for. We don't think so. We don't necessarily think that women on the ground are going to be able to stand on your side when your side fights for intervention that is opposing a lot of arbitrary things. Because we think a lot of things that the feminist movement fights for in the West are arbitrary harms. For example, the ban on the burqa within liberal democracies is not something that the feminist movement within a lot of Muslim nations do support. Therefore, we think your harm is arbitrary in a lot of cases and will lose traction with women. What am I going to talk to you about? First, why do we lose the moral legitimacy for intervention? They argue they will support the intervention by Muslim states otherwise. We don't think Muslim states will intervene, or even if these are very liberal secular states like Turkey, which do not necessarily represent Islam per se, and states they've already seen with being complicit with the West. What happens? You're going to be imposing a post-modern feminism. Things like the female movement, which supported nude protests, or France, which opposes the burqa. These are very radical things that the feminist movement stands for in Western countries that will never be able to fly within cultural feminist movements in Middle Eastern countries. No. So we therefore think that your side clumps together objective harms and subjective harms. objective harms like hitting women and stoning women, with subjective harms like the burqa and religious things that women do, or within foreign law where women don't get inherited. These are things that now you clump together. What happens on your side? When you clump this thing together, you disengage with the people who believe in cultural feminism. A lot of women within these countries believe in religious feminism, where they do support the religious version of feminism, but not the harms that exist of objectivity. What your side does is you force women to take a stance against your entire intervention, where they are now forced to pick between religion and feminism, and that's harmful because now you'll never be able to stand all the objective harms that come with it. So your side entrenches oppression because women now will not stand for feminism as it's seen as a Western sentiment, it's seen as something that opposes their religion. Therefore, you cannot help women to escape things like stoning because now they associate that with something I have to do in order to be a good Muslim woman. This comes with a few harms. There are 4 harms. But before that, sure.
Ma'am, my ally already told you, right? It's not that we're fighting for them to have things like sexual liberation, walk around their bras, that kind of thing. But the problem that we said was that there is no guarantee of human rights for these people, and that's what we're trying to fight for, right? There's basic entry-level rights. What's wrong with that?
We agree. We agree that you're going to fight for those type of things, but because the Western nations are doing so, and it comes with a lot of other restrictions, it's going to be associated. And we think that association in itself isolates women. How does it isolate women? Few things. Number one, we think that in the event where you're able to have policies on the ground, where you do get a government that functions, these policies will have a glass ceiling. That means the implementation of these policies will not work. For example, men will still not employ women within the employment field. They will still not grant women the right to licenses. They'll use meritocracy as an example because there's no acceptance of that policy per se. We think that glass ceiling will still exist. Second, you force women to isolate themselves further. Women who wanted to speak up politically or wanted to move within the arena will now be further victimized and further harmed, not because they are women, but because they support a Western sentiment. So you remove the ability of women on the ground to fight for themselves. But fourthly, your side also forces women to not be able, your side forces women to never penetrate the political space. What do I mean? This means that now, instead of them naturally moving up, like Nora Al-Faiz did in 2009, these women will never be able to implement policies that support women. They'll never be able to represent people in politics because there's going to be a victimization of women within those states. So we think your side forces women to isolate themselves and never be able to move the social hierarchy because of their identity. You force women to hide within enclaves because they're no longer representing women in Islam, they're going to be representing a Western interest. So they're never going to be elected into office, they're never going to be able to get jobs because they're not one with the society, they're one with the invading forces.
All right. Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
We understand that certain states which OG wants to talk about may seem to be somewhat progressive. Right? We understand that in certain conservative states, women are not being stoned every single day. We understand that maybe they're being given some rights. But here's the thing: we think that the only time when these military interventions happen is because things like negotiations are not working. It means that there is no product of these kinds of cultural feminist movements or just feminist movement as a whole in these countries, which means that these women are not being given their basic human rights. They're not being allowed to go to school. They're being stoned in the street, and they're even being suspected of committing some kind of sexual immorality. Right? That's a problem that exists here. And the reason why we need to be able to support military intervention is this: that if you wait for the organic change that Side OG wants to talk about, there will be too many women that die. There will be too many women that are raped for no good reason because they want to wait for the men to change on their own. But here's the thing, right? I'm going to be talking to you about two things. First, I will strengthen what Mani told you about exactly how do we envision these military movements come up, because it's a characterization that they largely try to ignore. Second, I'll talk about this characterization. What is the feminist movement like? What do they support? And how is this in line with what they support? And third, I'll talk about how this affects the perception of the world of feminism and how this is good for it. No, thank you. But before that, let's talk a little bit about some responses. Because we heard a few ideas from that. First of all, Ahmed told us that there will be no sustainability, right? Because there will be never any change. You have to keep on killing every single person who has some form of patriarchal views in their mind. That's not the case, right? What is it that we already told you? We think that it's a good idea if we can come into these military interventions, right? If we have some form of leverage, right? In fact, if we are able to have this threat of intervention when we have negotiations with them, because why are negotiations not working right now? Because they know that if, because people like, the Taliban or whatever, they know that if they don't agree with the kinds of values that, Western states are trying to negotiate with them, there's nothing that will happen to them, right? Because they know that they cannot intervene with them. They know that there will be nothing that happens to them, and therefore they have all the power here. But if we can have, if we are able to have the real threat of being able to intervene later on, we think that that's something that can really change the way and change the game in terms of how we can talk to them. But how is it that we think that change can really happen, right? We think that pressure can come in terms of political change. No, thank you. What does this mean? It means that we are able, if we are able to help somehow change their policies in order to, do things like banning honor killings like that. And we think it is very effective, right? Because, for example, there was a ban on honor killings that happened in Pakistan, right? And at first, it's true, right? A lot of people were against that. They were like, oh, it's part of my religion. It's all right if I do so. So there were honor killings that still happened illegally. But what happened was that in the long term, people were able to rationalize within themselves that, hey, this is actually wrong. While we may accept that there are still certain pockets that still engage in honor killings, right? That is generally something that is not accepted in Pakistan, and they have moved on in that sense, right? We understand that it will take a while, right? But we think that policy changes are what can really change mindsets. If we allow them to change on their own without some kind of push, there will be too much collateral damage, as I'm trying to say, while waiting for that. But the second thing that they talked to you about was that there must be an alternative. There's all these other things that the feminist movement can do, right? And we should support cultural feminism. We shouldn't be doing things like supporting sexual liberation, because that also goes against the women on the ground. But here's the thing, we're okay with that. We support cultural feminism as well. The question here is this: can cultural feminism support itself, right? Can these women on the ground who are not being taken seriously, can these women on the ground who are not even allowed to speak sometimes in the presence of males, can they make a difference unless we help them out, right? We're not saying that we're going to impose every single liberal value onto the sun over there. We're just saying that we want to give them those basic human rights, right? The only thing that we heard from Amrit was this, that, as long as they associate the movement with being liberal, then they'll never accept it. We can always make ourselves clear, give a campaign, give them a proof or something about what it is that we support. Now let's talk about what I'm trying to say, but before that, close it.
Given that consent is very hard to obtain during the conflict, will the woman who through the damage to their country and homes themselves be able to even decide the cost of action taken inside their costs?
Okay, if there is a cultural feminist movement over there, we can discuss with them, we can try to speak to that, right? But in any case, we will do our very best in order to forward the movement of the feminist movement in terms of giving them the rights that they need. So let's talk about the feminist movement. What is it this for? They have two different aims, right? First, political equality, and second, social equality. This means that they fight for things, that means that they have responsibilities not only to change certain policies, but they also have a responsibility to change the mindsets of people on the ground. Which means that in order to get this thing, they need to be able to use any way and any means necessary in order to achieve those aims. Because they're not a government where they have to care about all these different kinds of ramifications that they have to worry about what actually happened. So how have we achieved these kinds of social and political equalities before? Things like riots, campaigns, the suffrage movement, right? When negotiations happen. And we're happy when these kinds of things succeed, right? But the thing is, this is not happening, right? There's no political pressure that is sufficient to change these people's minds, and we need the masses in order to do that. But the problem is that, however, in cultural feminist movements, they're not being accepted. No, thank you. So let's then talk about this third idea. How do we affect the perception of the world on feminism? We need to understand, in order to understand this, we need to delve into the mindset of these patriarchal leaders. Why do they do what they do? Is it because they hate women, or is it because they believe it is their God and right? We think that they don't think that they're doing so. We think that they think that this is just normal, and that it's completely fine for them to do so. And then when they are in negotiations, they simply think, they're not fighting with me, they're not really pushing it that hard, so it can't be that big of a deal. They genuinely believe that these things are a power given to them by God. No, thank you. Right? This is why we think that negotiations don't work. That's why we think that grassroots change doesn't work, because there is no sense of urgency in them. Because we believe that there is nothing that's going to happen to them. That if it does happen in the future, then it can be 100 years when I'm dead and I don't have to experience such horrible things. Right? But the thing is this. That is because there is no sense of urgency. That's why things are not happening, because they know that these kinds of negotiations and things will never have to work out. However, if we are able to give them this sense of urgency, right? If you can have these kinds of military intervention, because the expectation that we view was this, right? That these countries are easily overpowered by like even just the US military because they spend the most on their military budget, right? We think that considering that, we will only be able to go and get these military interventions if they could reasonably expect to succeed. Otherwise, these interventions wouldn't have been given the green light by Congress, right? Which means that it's very likely that they'll be able to succeed in terms of overpowering them and affecting the kinds of policy changes that they want to. So how is this good? Then we can make it quick and we can make it clean. We can even put in things like quotas for women in the parliament if that is something that they require. But what needs to happen here is this, right? That we need to give women a sense of importance within these societies. They're not important at all. We need to change policies and we need to change the mindsets from the top in order for them to have any kind of change. Thank you.
Okay. So David, one of the awards, I think now
Have to give him access to them.
okay. And you give him also the one before this that we were recording when I was talking to you guys, you did available online now.
Yeah.
Can you online?
It's private.
Okay. Can you share the link with it?
Okay, but I'll have to shut it down first. That's the thing.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So maybe until after the debate, then I can open up more videos for it.
No, I want it. Okay, stop it for a while, and then share the link first, the first light up WhatsApp first, and then
There's a link there.
Yeah, but just go there. Link. No, but both the videos are private, so even if I give them the link, they can't use. So unless I put their emails, I have to put their emails in to give them access to it.